Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a room on Terra that does not exist. No cartographer has ever drawn it. No administratum scribe has ever catalogued it. No pilgrim making the long, exhausted journey to the throne world has ever been told of its location. And if they were somehow to stumble toward it in the labyrinthine corridors of the Imperial Palace, they would find their path redirected by men with golden armor and unreadable faces. Men who would not explain themselves. Men who would simply be there between the pilgrim and the door until the pilgrim walked away. Inside that room, if it existed, and it does not, according to every official record of the Imperium of Man, there are shelves, and on those shelves are documents that would, if they were read by the wrong person, rewrite everything that person thought they understood about the galaxy they live in, about the god they pray to, about the nature of the Imperium itself. Some of these documents would simply unsettle. At others, would shatter faith entirely. A few of them, the ones with the oldest seals, the ones whose pages feel strange to the touch, as though the parchment itself is uncomfortable being read, would do something far worse. They would make everything make sense. Because the ugliest truths are not the ones that horrify you. The ugliest truths are the ones that explain too much, the ones that slot into place with a terrible, quiet logic and leave you sitting there in the dark wondering how you never saw it before, wondering who decided you should never see it, wondering what else you don't know. My name is Q, and welcome back to Q on 40k, the channel where we sit with the lights low and we open the doors that are supposed to stay shut. Today, we are going deep. Deeper than the Horus Heresy, deeper than the Great Crusade. We are going back to the very beginning of what the Emperor of Mankind is. Yet we are following the thread through the darkest chapters of Imperial history, and we are asking the question that the Inquisition has spent 10,000 years making sure ordinary citizens never ask. Who really was the Emperor? What did he actually want? What did he do to get it? And what does the Imperium of Man, that vast and grinding machine of faith and violence, owe its continued existence to? Truth, or something much, much older and more dangerous than truth. Settle in, take a breath, and understand before we begin that in a setting where everything is true and none of it is accurate, the most dangerous thing you can do is start paying attention. Part 1. Born from Death. The Ritual of the Shamans. Every story has a beginning, and the story of the Emperor of Mankind begins so far back in the past that it barely feels like history anymore. It feels like myth. And it feels like something a grandmother might whisper to a child in a firelit room, while outside the wind moves through a forest that has never heard the sound of a chainsword, never felt the shadow of a drop pod, never known anything more terrifying than a winter storm. But this myth has teeth. This myth has consequences that are still being felt right now in the 41st millennium on battlefields from one end of the galaxy to the other. The story begins in the Neolithic period of old Earth, our ancient Earth, a time before cities had walls tall enough to be called walls, before men and women had learned to write their names, before even the faintest ghost of what would become the Imperium had drawn its first breath. In small communities scattered across the continents, some of them in the forests of what future ages would call Europe, some in the river valleys of the land that would eventually be known as the Middle East, as some along coastlines and plains that no longer exist in any recognizable form. There were individuals who were different. They were called shamans. The word is imprecise by the standards of later imperial scholarship, but it captures something true. These were human beings who had developed a capacity that most of their contemporaries lacked. They could feel the warp, not in the way that a trained psyker of the 41st millennium might feel it, not with years of conditioning and the protective scaffolding of imperial doctrine. They felt it the way a child feels summer warmth through a window, naturally, instinctively, as a fundamental part of their experience of the world. They were the first human psykers, the ancestors of every navigator, every astropath, every sanctioned witch who has ever bled their mind dry in the service of the Imperium. And for a long time they served a role in their communities that was genuinely, quietly beautiful. They guided their tribes. They acted as intermediaries between the living and whatever lay beyond death. They used their abilities, clumsy, untrained, powerful, in ways they themselves could not fully understand, to benefit the people around them. When a shaman died, their soul would transfer into the warp. It accumulated power there, and then, carrying those accumulated energies, it would reincarnate into a new human body, and the cycle would begin again. These were not godlings, they were not monsters, they were people, doing the best they could with gifts they had not asked for, in a universe that was already far stranger and more dangerous than any of them fully understood. But the universe was changing. As humanity spread across old Earth, as civilizations grew and hierarchies formed, and the raw collective emotional weight of billions of human beings began to echo through the warp in ways that had never happened before. Yes, something was shifting in that immaterial sea of psychic energy. The entities that fed on human emotion, entities that would eventually be known by names like Khorne and Tzeentch and Nurgle, though at this period they were still forming, still coalescing from the raw energy of mortal feeling, were growing stronger. The warp, which had been a relatively navigable space, was becoming darker, more turbulent, more hungry. And the shamans felt it first. They noticed that their deaths were changing. That when they died, the journey back to rebirth was no longer the serene transit it had once been. They were being hunted in that space between lives, picked off by entities they could barely perceive, their accumulated souls consumed by the very forces that were growing fat on the rest of humanity's psychic emissions. Their reincarnation cycle, which had sustained them for millennia, was breaking down, and they understood what this meant, not just for themselves, but for the entire human species. Because without shamans, without people who could perceive the warp, who could navigate its dangers, who could act as a buffer between ordinary humanity and the things that lived in it, there would be nothing standing between the growing dark and the billions of people who couldn't even see it coming. So they held a council. According to the oldest records, the discussion lasted for centuries, conducted in the slow, generational time of beings who could reincarnate, who could carry their memories across lifetimes, who had literally all the time in the world. They debated, they disagreed, they returned to the question again and again across generations. And eventually, they came to a decision. They decided to stop existing as individuals. The plan they devised was extraordinary in its ambition and terrible in its personal cost. Every surviving shaman on the face of old Earth gathered their consciousness, yet their accumulated psychic power, the totality of everything they had learned and remembered across countless lifetimes, and committed mass ritual suicide, thousands of them, poisoning themselves simultaneously, their souls rushing into the warp all at once, combining in a single vast surge of psychic energy that was powerful enough, just barely powerful enough, to overwhelm the hungry entities that had been picking them off one by one. That pooled soul energy, carrying with it the combined wisdom and power of every shaman who had ever walked the earth, was then directed toward a single purpose. 1 year later, somewhere in the valley of the Sakarya River in central Anatolia, the land that would eventually be known as Turkey, a child was born to mortal parents who had no idea what had happened, no idea what slept in the body of their infant, no idea what they had brought into the world. That child was the emperor. He was born around 8000 BCE, which means he has been alive in one form or another for roughly 10,000 years before the 41st millennium even begins. He came into the world carrying inside him not just his own potential, but the combined essence of every shaman who had sacrificed themselves to create him. As he grew, he began to remember. Slowly at first, and then with increasing clarity, he remembered thousands of past lives, thousands of names and faces and skills and pieces of hard-won understanding about the nature of existence that no single person should ever have been able to accumulate. He was called, by those who would eventually know him best, the new man. The next stage of human evolution, bootstrapped into existence, by the dying act of the generation that came before. A being whose psychic power was so vast that the forces that had been picking off individual shamans like sparrows could not touch him. A mind so ancient and so deep that when he looked at the warp, he saw it clearly, and crucially, he was not afraid of what he saw. Now, pause here, because this matters. The Inquisition knows this story. The highest levels of the Inquisition know it intimately, and they have spent 10,000 years making absolutely certain that the average citizen of the Imperium, the soldier on the wall, the priest in the cathedral, the pilgrim shuffling toward the throne world with burning feet and a heart full of devotion, does not. Because the story of the shamans fundamentally contradicts the story that the Imperium needs people to believe. The Imperial Creed holds that the Emperor is a god, divine and eternal, placed in the universe by the grace of some transcendent power to shepherd humanity toward its destiny. The story of the shamans says something quite different. But it says that the Emperor is the product of a desperate, improvised plan by frightened human beings who were running out of time. It says he is not divinely appointed, but rather collectively constructed, built from the sacrifice of the only people who understood the situation well enough to see what was needed. It says, in other words, that he is not a god who chose to walk among us. He is the last thing a group of frightened humans built before they died, and in the hope that it would be enough to save everyone else. Whether that makes him more or less divine is a question that the Inquisition has decided you do not get to ask for yourself. But here is something else. The Inquisition would prefer you not examine too closely the Emperor himself when he has spoken on the subject, and he has spoken on it in the deep past, in conversations recorded by perpetuals who survived long enough to write things down, has said that he is just a man, not a god. Not a supernatural entity, a man built from unusual materials, with unusual abilities and an unusually long lifespan, trying to do an unusually difficult job. He said it to his primarchs, he said it to Malcador, he said it to anyone who asked him directly, and nobody believed him, which, when you think about it, is almost poetic. Part 2. 10,000 Years in the Shadows. Here is something that almost nobody in the 41st millennium truly grasps about the Emperor of mankind. Something that the Inquisition's careful management of historical records has smoothed over and simplified until it is almost invisible. Before the Great Crusade, before the Unification Wars, before any of the events that form the bedrock of imperial mythology, the Emperor lived. He just lived. For approximately 10,000 years. Not the 10,000 years of the Imperium's history, but a different 10,000 years. Before that, the being who would become the God Emperor of mankind walked among ordinary human beings under false names, with false histories, hiding what he was, and watching the world change around him. He was present for the entire span of recorded human history. He was there when the first cities rose in Mesopotamia. He was there when empires fell. He saw the rise and fall of Greece, Rome, the great medieval kingdoms, the scientific revolution, the space age, of the colonization of the solar system, the chaos of the age of strife. He saw all of it, and he intervened carefully, surgically, in places and moments where he calculated that his involvement would make a measurable difference to humanity's long-term trajectory. The name Neoth appears in the oldest records, the name he used in the deepest antiquity, in the centuries immediately following his birth, when he was still learning what he was. He is also referred to, while in various fragmentary sources of questionable reliability, by names that would be recognized by anyone familiar with human mythology and history. The notion that certain historical figures of unusual capability and influence might have been the emperor in a disguise is one that recurs across several centuries of imperial scholarship. Though the Ordo Redactus, the Inquisition's dedicated history suppression bureau, has worked diligently to ensure that those scholarly works never reach mainstream circulation. Was he Alexander of Macedon, whose campaigns reshaped the ancient world? Was he some of the great lawgivers, the philosophers who shaped human thought so fundamentally that their ideas still echo 10,000 years later? There are clues scattered through the oldest surviving records. But most of those records have been sanitized, and the ones that haven't are locked in vaults that require an inquisitorial seal even to approach. What we know is this. During his long centuries of hidden life, the Emperor was not idle. He was working. He was observing the warp and watching the slow accumulation of psychic energy as human civilization grew, as human emotion poured into that immaterial sea in increasing quantities. And as the entities forming in that space became larger and more coherent and more dangerous, he understood, with a clarity that no one else possessed, exactly what was coming and approximately how long humanity had before it arrived. He also understood something that very few people, even today, have fully grasped, that he could not save humanity alone. He was immensely powerful, yes, but one person, however extraordinary, cannot personally shepherd a species of billions across a galaxy of 100,000 light years. He needed infrastructure, he needed tools, he needed allies, and he needed them to be powerful enough to actually help him, rather than simply becoming new problems. So he spent 10,000 years preparing. He recruited other perpetuals, those rare human beings who, like himself, could not be killed permanently, who died and came back, those who had accumulated their own centuries of experience and capability. He built networks of contacts across old Earth. He studied the warp with a patience and depth that no one else could match. He experimented with genetics, with psychic theory, with the mechanisms of human evolution, laying the groundwork for technologies that would not be deployed for millennia. The perpetual Erda was among those he found and recruited in this period. She would eventually become one of his most important collaborators in the creation of the Primarchs. And then, in a moment of moral crisis, one of the most significant people to turn away from him. She knew him as Neoth, and she described him, in the fragmentary records that survive, as already carrying an overwhelming sense of purpose. Not arrogance, something heavier than arrogance. The weight of a person who has looked at the future and understood exactly how bad it is going to get if things go wrong, and who has decided to spend the rest of their life, which is, in their case, indefinitely long, doing whatever is necessary to prevent that outcome. There is something both admirable and deeply unsettling about that picture. A man who has decided, 10,000 years before the fact, what the galaxy needs. A man who has been planning, quietly and alone, and for so long that the plans have become almost indistinguishable from who he is. A man who loves humanity, and there is every indication in the oldest records that he genuinely does, but who has also learned, over 10 millennia of watching what happens when humans are given information they're not ready for, that love sometimes looks like deception. Sometimes love looks like controlling the narrative. Sometimes it looks like deciding what people get to know, which is, when you strip away the golden armor and the psychic fire, the fundamental philosophical position that the Inquisition has inherited from him and carried forward into the 41st millennium. They are not an aberration. They are not a corruption of his vision. They are, in the most uncomfortable way possible, his direct ideological descendants. The hidden, controlling hand of someone who believes, with the best of intentions, or at least what they believe to be the best of intentions, that the people they're protecting cannot be trusted with the full truth. The Emperor lived in shadow for 10,000 years because he judged that the time for stepping into the light had not yet come. And eventually, when the age of strife had burned itself out, and the techno-barbarian warlords of old Earth were grinding humanity to pieces in their endless wars, he decided that the time had come. He stepped out of the shadows, and he raised his banner. He began the unification wars, and immediately everything he did required justification, and the justifications required management, and the management required people who were willing to do the necessary things without being fully informed about why the necessary things were necessary. That is the root of everything. The Emperor stepping into history is also the Emperor creating, for the first time, the system of controlled information that would eventually become one of the most powerful and feared organizations in the Imperium. He built the Inquisition into the structure of civilization, the way you build a foundation into a building. Before the walls go up, before the roof, before anyone else is looking. Part 3. The Dragon Beneath Mars. Before we get to the unification wars themselves, there is something we need to talk about. It is something that happened long before the first Thunder Warrior ever pulled on a suit of crude power armor and started breaking techno-barbarian warlords. Something that may be the single most audacious act of strategic manipulation in the entire history of the human species. The Emperor found a god and buried it in a planet. Not a metaphorical god, not a chaos entity, not a warp phenomenon that someone had mistaken for divinity. A real one, a Satan, one of the ancient, terrifying star gods of the Necron race, being so old and so powerful that entire civilizations had been built around the attempt to understand them, and entire civilizations had been destroyed when those attempts failed. Beings who had literally eaten stars for sustenance when the universe was young. The specific entity in question is known by several names. The Aeldari call it the Void Dragon, or Magladroth. The Necrons, who had a much more intimate and deeply traumatic relationship with it, knew it as one of the greatest of their former gods. The Adeptus Mechanicus of the 41st Millennium have a name for it too, though they don't know that the thing they're venerating and the thing buried beneath their sacred homeworld are the same entity. They call it the Omnissiah. Let us back up, because this requires some explanation. The Satan were, in the era of the War in Heaven, an ancient, galaxy-spanning conflict fought millions of years before the 41st Millennium between the Necrons and the Old Ones, among the most powerful physical entities in existence. They were beings of living metal who had consumed stars to sustain themselves, who had shaped the material universe according to their whims, who had engineered entire intelligent species and then used those species as tools. They were the closest thing to gods that the material universe has ever produced. And they were not benevolent gods. They were not gods who cared about the beings who worshipped them. They were predators on a cosmic scale. The Necrons eventually revolted against their Satan masters, shattering them into fragments and imprisoning those fragments in dimensional containers. But not every Satan was fully defeated. Not every fragment was fully contained. The Void Dragon, Magladroth, was the most technologically sophisticated of all the Catan. It was the one most deeply aligned with the principles of physics and engineering, the one whose power expressed itself through mastery of the material world, rather than through brute force or subtle manipulation. It was, in a very specific sense, the closest thing the universe had ever produced to a god of machines. At some point in the very deep past, the records are fragmentary and deliberately obscured, and the dates are contested. The Emperor encountered a fragment of the Void Dragon. Now, the exact circumstances of this encounter are preserved primarily in the memories of the Guardians of the Dragon, a secret order of perpetuals that the Emperor himself established to watch over what came next, and their accounts are deeply unreliable because they experience the dragon's memories directly, and the dragon's memories are not organized in ways that human minds find easy to process. What we know is this: the Emperor fought the Void Dragon. The fight was recorded in mythological fragments that survived into the Common Era, as the story of St. George and the Dragon, a hero on horseback defeating a terrible monster. That story is probably not literally accurate in every detail, but it preserves the essential truth that a fight happened and that the Emperor won. Or, more precisely, that the Emperor won the battle without being able to win the war. Here's because the Void Dragon was not something that could be permanently destroyed by any power the Emperor possessed. He couldn't kill it. So he did the next best thing. He carried it, somehow, through means that are not fully explained in any surviving record, to the planet Mars, and he buried it in the deepest, most geologically stable location he could find in the Noctis Labyrinthus, a vast system of canyons and subterranean passages on the Martian surface. Yet he placed it in a Necron-built stasis tomb that had been constructed for exactly this kind of containment. He appointed a guardian, a Terran woman named Dalia Cythera, transformed into a perpetual specifically for this task, to watch over it and ensure its bonds held. And then he waited. He waited and watched as the passive influence of the imprisoned void dragon, its dreams, seeping through even the stasis field like warmth through a stone wall, began to affect the human settlers on Mars. Those settlers, in the early millennia of Mars's colonization, began to develop an unusual obsession with technology, an unusual reverence for machines, an unusual belief that the study and preservation of mechanical knowledge was a sacred calling rather than simply a practical skill. They built their society around this belief. They developed rituals and hierarchies and philosophical frameworks that centered on the idea that technology itself was holy. They became, in other words, the cult Mechanicus, the precursor to the Adeptus Mechanicus, the priesthood of Mars, and the central deity of that priesthood, the Omnissiah, the machine god, the entity they believed to be the source of all technological knowledge and the spiritual heart of their faith, was the void dragon, sleeping beneath their feet, dreaming into their minds, slowly, unconsciously, shaping an entire civilization into a form that the Emperor could use. When the Emperor eventually established formal relations with Mars, when he struck the Treaty of Mars in 739.M30, that incorporated the priesthood into the nascent Imperium, he did not correct their theology. He did not say, "Your god is an alien predator that I have imprisoned under your planet, and your faith is the product of its passive psychic influence on your ancestors." He allowed them to believe that the Omnissiah was an aspect of himself, that he allowed the comfortable fiction that the machine god and the Emperor were the same entity, or at least complementary manifestations of the same divine principle. Why? Because he needed them. Because without the manufacturing capacity of Mars, without the forge worlds and the shipyards and the technical expertise that the Mechanicus had accumulated across millennia of devotion to their god, the Great Crusade was impossible. Without the Mechanicus, there were no space marine power suits. As without the Mechanicus, there were no warships. Without the Mechanicus, there was no Imperium. So he made a deal. He allowed the Mechanicus their faith, even though he knew it was built on a foundation of alien psychic influence. He allowed them to believe in the Omnissiah, even though the closest thing to a real Omnissiah was a shattered god sleeping in a Necron sarcophagus 3 kilometers below the surface of their sacred homeworld. This is, it bears saying, one of the most remarkable acts of strategic pragmatism in recorded history. The Emperor needed the Mechanicus. The Mechanicus needed their faith. The faith was built on a lie. The lie was, in a sense, true. The dragon's influence had genuinely shaped their civilization, genuinely inspired their technological development, genuinely created something extraordinary out of nothing. So was it really a lie? Or was it just a truth that had been observed from the wrong angle? The Inquisition has a very clear position on this question, which is that you should not be asking it. The Order Redactus has spent considerable effort ensuring that the very concept of a connection between the Dragon of Mars and the Omnissiah is classified at levels that require more security clearance than most people in the Imperium even know exist. Certain branches of the Mechanicus are aware of the dragon's existence, the most secret cults within the Order. Of the ones who have access to the deep archives of Mars understand that something vast and ancient sleeps beneath the Noctis Labyrinthus. Some of them worship it directly, without the polite fiction of the Omnissiah as an aspect of the Emperor. And the Inquisition watches those cults very, very carefully. Because if the dragon ever woke up, if whatever Necron technology keeps it in stasis were to fail or be tampered with, or simply reach the end of its operational lifespan after millions of years of continuous function, the most likely outcome is that every tech priest in the Mechanicus would immediately recognize their true god and transfer their loyalty to it without a second thought. In 998 M41, a Necron fleet punched through the Sol System's defenses, screamed through space at full speed, reached Mars, landed in the vicinity of the Noctis Labyrinthus, and sat there for a moment before being destroyed. They had crossed an entire star system, risked direct conflict with the greatest military power in the galaxy, and taken casualties that would have been considered catastrophic for any human fleet. Just to check on the dragon, just to confirm that it was still there and still contained. What does it tell you about a prisoner that its former jailers will cross a star system just to make sure it hasn't gotten out? And what does it tell you about the Emperor that he decided to use that prisoner as the foundation of an entire civilization? Part 4. The Deal at Molech. Now we arrive at one of the most contested, most debated, and most carefully suppressed pieces of lore in the entire 40k setting. A story that the Inquisition has not merely attempted to bury, but has actively rewritten multiple times, each rewrite making it slightly less comprehensible, slightly less coherent, and slightly more likely to be dismissed as heretical fantasy if anyone stumbles across fragments of it. The story of what the Emperor did on Molech. Molech is, or was, before the Horus heresy, a night world. One of those planets settled early in humanity's great diaspora, where the old technologies of the dark age of mankind had been partially preserved, where the noble houses that rode in massive walking war machines maintained a civilization that was feudal in structure but extraordinary in its military capability. It was, by most accounts, a reasonably pleasant world. Green and jungle-covered, with a climate that humans found hospitable. A population that had maintained a degree of stability through the long nightmare of the Age of Strife. A culture that was unusual but not pathological. It was also the location of something the Emperor had known about for a very long time. Deep beneath the surface of Molech, in a cave network that the indigenous population had sealed with religious prohibitions and warnings passed down through countless generations, there was a portal, a gateway into the warp itself. Not the incidental thinning of the boundary that occurs near warp storms or places of great psychic activity, but a deliberately constructed stable, as permanent doorway between the material universe and the Imperium. Who built it originally is unknown. The best guesses involve the old ones, the ancient alien race who had shaped so many aspects of the galaxy before the war in heaven destroyed them. But nothing is confirmed. What matters is that it existed, and that the Emperor knew about it, and that at some point in the very deep past, long before the Unification Wars, he made a journey to Molech specifically to use it. And he arrived on Molech in a starship, accompanied by a small group of perpetuals. He arrived secretly, under cover of night, without announcement or ceremony. He went into the cave network beneath the surface. He walked through the portal. He was inside the warp for a period that is difficult to measure in standard time, because time inside the warp does not correspond reliably to time in the material universe. When he came back out, the starship was gone. He had arrived in a vessel, and he left, apparently, by other means. And he had something he had not carried with him when he went in, not a physical object. Something more fundamental than that. Knowledge, understanding, power of a kind and magnitude that even he, for all his 10,000 years of accumulated experience and psychic development, had not previously possessed. Yet, according to the demon that later revealed this story to Horus, who told him specifically to destabilize his sense of his father's righteousness, so the source has obvious motivation to shade the truth. The Emperor entered the warp, found the Chaos Gods or their representatives, and made a bargain with them. He received the knowledge necessary to create the Primarchs, and the power to channel warp energy in the way that would be required to imbue his gene sons with the supernatural qualities that made them more than simply very large, very skilled human soldiers. In exchange, the Chaos Gods expected something in return, though exactly what that something was is, deliberately, one suspects, never specified in any surviving source. What the demon told Horus was that the Emperor made the bargain and then broke it, that he took what he needed and gave back nothing, or gave back something other than what had been agreed. That the Chaos Gods, furious at this betrayal, branded him the Anathema, their word for him, the title they use even in the 41st Millennium, not merely because he opposes them ideologically, but because he cheated them personally. Now This is where you have to hold multiple contradictory things in your head simultaneously, which is, frankly, the only honest way to engage with 40k lore. But the first thing to hold, the demon might be lying. Demons do that. Chaos gods do that. The revelation was delivered to Horus at a moment specifically calculated to maximize its destabilizing effect by an entity whose only real investment in the situation was the desire to see Horus betray his father. The demon's account cannot be taken as a straightforward factual record. The second thing to hold, the Emperor himself never addressed these allegations directly. But in all the conversations recorded between him and his primarchs, in all the moments where he had the opportunity to say, that story about Molech is false, and here is the truth, he did not do so. He did not explain Molech. He did not explain what happened there. He simply left the question hanging, which is exactly what someone does when the truth is more complicated than any available answer. The third thing to hold, the primarchs are real. They exist. They are extraordinary beings who combine human genetics with something that is demonstrably not purely human. They touch the warp in ways that ordinary humans do not. They possess qualities that cannot be explained by genetic engineering alone. They were literally created using techniques that required warp energy in their construction. The knowledge to do this had to come from somewhere. The capability to do this had to be learned somehow, and the Emperor, or for all his 10,000 years of experience, did not possess it before Molech. Something happened on Molech. The Emperor gained something on Molech that he did not have before, and what he gained made the primarchs possible. The most considered reading of the available evidence, acknowledging the obvious unreliability of the sources, is something like this. The Emperor entered the warp at Molech. He is seeking specific knowledge about the mechanics of warp soul integration that would allow him to imbue his gene sons with aspects of his own psychic essence. He found what he was looking for, whether he formally bargained for it or simply took it, whether any agreement was made or the demon's account of a betrayed deal is pure invention, is genuinely unknown. What is known is that he came out of that portal with what he needed, and that he then spent the next phase of his existence using that knowledge to create 20 of the most remarkable beings in human history. He also did something else on Molech, something the records are clearer about, even if the significance of it was not understood until much later. He left a guardian there, a perpetual woman named Olivia Soreka. He left her on Molech with a single instruction. If anything ever threatens to breach that portal from the inside, close it, permanently, whatever it takes. Then he went back to Terra and began the Unification Wars, and he erased Molech from his own presence in the historical record. And he brought 4 of his Primarch sons to Molech during the Great Crusade, and erased the memory of its significance from their minds as well. Because he knew, with the long, terrible patience of someone who has been planning for 10,000 years, that the portal might be needed again, not by him, but by whoever rebelled against him, by whatever son was eventually corrupted enough to seek the same kind of power he had gained there. He needed the trap to look like a secret worth finding, and Horus found it, and Horus walked through that portal. And when Horus came out of the warp, he was exactly what the Emperor needed him to be, a being of immense power, channeling the will of the Chaos Gods, headed in a perfectly straight and predictable line toward Terra, and a confrontation that the Emperor had, in some sense, been preparing for since before Horus was born. The Inquisition's position on Molech is that the records are classified, the story is unverified, and anyone repeating it is potentially spreading chaos-tainted propaganda, which is, when you think about it, exactly what you would say if you didn't want people examining too closely the possibility that your God had made, and possibly broken, a bargain with the forces of ultimate evil. And it's also exactly what you would say if the truth was so much more complicated than either the Emperor is pure and righteous, or the Emperor is corrupt and compromised, that there simply isn't a version of the story that doesn't make everyone uncomfortable. The Emperor went to Molech. He did something there, and then he set a trap using what he had done. And 10,000 years later, humanity is still paying the price of the bait. Part 5. The Imperial Truth and the Great Lie.
I want to pause here for just a second, step outside the archive for a moment, because this part of the lore is one that I find myself going back to more than almost anything else in 40k. The Emperor's relationship with truth is the thing that gets me every time. Not the wars, not the psychic powers, not the 10,000 years of history. It is the fact that he knew the Chaos Gods were real and chose to build the entire Imperium on a philosophy that pretended they weren't. And I genuinely cannot decide if that was the bravest thing anyone has ever attempted or the most catastrophic act of arrogance in human history. Maybe both. Probably both. That tension between someone who was clearly brilliant and clearly wrong in ways that cost millions of lives is why this lore lives in my head the way it does. There are no clean answers here, and I think that is exactly why it is worth talking about. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Of all the things the Inquisition needs you not to think about too carefully, this one might be the most straightforward in its structure and the most devastating in its implications. The Emperor knew the Chaos Gods were real, not suspected, not feared, not entertained the theoretical possibility, knew with certainty, with the directness of personal, intimate experience dating back at least to Molech, probably much further. And he knew that the warp was inhabited by vast, ancient, powerful entities that fed on the psychic emissions of intelligent life and that actively sought to corrupt and consume humanity. He knew that these entities were, in a meaningful sense, the defining existential threat that his entire civilizational project was designed to address. He knew all of this. And then he built the foundational philosophy of the Imperium on the explicit denial that any of it was true. The imperial truth was the doctrine that guided the Great Crusade. It was the philosophical framework that the Emperor's iterators, those smooth-tongued missionaries who followed behind the Space Marine legions to remake the cultures of freshly compliant worlds, propagated across 100,000 worlds over the course of 2 centuries. It was, in its essence, a rationalist materialism. The universe is physical. Reality is observable. Supernatural entities do not exist. Religion is a primitive response to ignorance that will be abolished, along with all other forms of superstition, to be replaced by science and reason and the rational authority of the Imperium. It was, the Emperor intended, the antidote to chaos. The logic was not stupid. In fact, it was quite elegant in its way. The Chaos Gods draw power from the emotional and psychic emissions of intelligent life. Worship feeds them. Fear feeds them. Love feeds them. Every sincere prayer directed at a supernatural entity channels psychic energy into the warp and makes the things that live there stronger. The imperial truth, by eliminating religion and replacing it with rational materialism, was designed to starve the Chaos Gods, to reduce the flow of psychic energy into the warp by redirecting human emotion away from entities that could feed on it and towards secular life. It was, in other words, not a lie born of ignorance. It was a calculated strategy. The Emperor knew the truth. He chose to suppress it because he believed that widespread knowledge of the Chaos Gods would result in exactly the thing he was trying to prevent: mass worship, mass fear, mass feeding. There is a version of this decision that you can respect if you squint at it from the right angle. You can see the utilitarian logic. You can see a being who has watched over 10,000 years. And what happens when humanity is given accurate information about the warp? How quickly fear curdles into worship. How quickly genuine warnings become the raw material of new religions. How reliably the attempt to warn people about chaos results in more people touching chaos. You can see someone who has concluded, with the weight of genuine experience behind him, that the only safe path is controlled ignorance. What you cannot do is pretend that this decision did not have catastrophic consequences, because there was a primarch who found his legion making progress that the Emperor deemed too slow. A primarch who had been raised on a world where faith was the organizing principle of society, where the idea of devotion to something greater than oneself was the most fundamental moral intuition anyone possessed. As a primarch who looked at the imperial truth and found it not just philosophically unsatisfying, but actively harmful. a doctrine that stripped people of meaning, that told them their deepest instincts were primitive errors, that offered them nothing in the place of what it took away. That Primarch was Lorgar Aurelian, the Urizen, the master of words, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion. Lorgar believed in the Emperor with a genuine, almost agonizing sincerity. He believed his father was divine. He believed that the Great Crusade was a sacred mission. And because he believed this, he did what any sincere religious believer does when they encounter something that strikes them as holy. He told people. He built cathedrals. He preached. He converted entire worlds, not just to imperial compliance, but to active worship of the Emperor as God. And the Emperor, who knew the Chaos Gods were real, and whose strategy for defeating them required that nobody worship anything, humiliated him publicly, brutally, and completely. He had the city of Monarchia, a place Lorgar had built specifically to celebrate the Emperor's divinity, a city of cathedrals and spires that had become one of the most beautiful places in the known galaxy, leveled by the Ultramarines, razed to the ground. Then he came in person and forced the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel in the rubble and told them they had failed him. Consider what that meant to Lorgar. He had spent his entire life worshipping his creator with every fiber of his being, expressing that worship in the most beautiful forms he could devise, and his creator had sent another legion to destroy the best thing he had ever built, and then came in person to say that the worship itself was the offense. The Emperor knew about chaos. Lorgar did not. The Emperor had reasons for what he did. Lorgar could not have known those reasons, because telling Lorgar the reasons would have defeated the purpose of the strategy. So Lorgar went looking for gods that would accept his worship, and he found them. And the rest, as they say, is the Horus heresy, the brutal irony. And this is the kind of irony that 40k does so well. It's the irony that cuts deep enough to draw blood, is that the imperial truth ultimately produced exactly what it was designed to prevent. By refusing to tell Lorgar the truth about chaos, by giving him no framework to understand why the Emperor's restrictions were necessary, the Emperor created the conditions for the most devoted and sincere of his sons to become the most effective agent of chaos the galaxy has ever seen. But Lorgar didn't turn to the Chaos Gods because he was weak or corrupt or secretly evil. He turned to them because he needed to believe in something, and the Emperor had stripped away everything he believed in without offering anything in its place. And then, in the desperate years after the heresy, when the Chaos Gods had proven they were real in the most catastrophic possible way, and the imperial truth was obviously and permanently discredited, the institution that replaced it was the one thing the Emperor had most specifically tried to prevent. The ecclesiarchy, the state religion, the deification of the Emperor himself, the billions of prayers directed daily at the corpse on the golden throne, prayers that, by the logic of the warp, are doing exactly what prayers always do in this universe. They are feeding something. The question that the Inquisition absolutely does not want anyone asking aloud, is what exactly they are feeding, and whether that thing, whatever it is, was what the Emperor intended all along. Part 6. The Thunder Warriors, a hidden genocide. There is a name that every Space Marine knows, a name that appears in the founding documents of the Adeptus Astartes, in the ceremonial texts recited at the induction of new recruits, in the histories taught to scouts in the farthest fortress monasteries from Terra, a name carved in stone and remembered with reverence and a kind of grief. Aric Tyrannus, the Lightning Bearer, Victor of Gaduare, Last Rider, Butcher of Scandia, Throne Slayer, the man who, at the Battle of Mount Ararat, raised the banner of lightning at the final declaration of unity, establishing the Emperor's rule over the entirety of Old Earth, before succumbing to his wounds in the moment of his greatest triumph. Every Space Marine knows this story. Every Space Marine accepts it as true. Aric Tyrannus was alive during the Horus Heresy. He was not a ghost. He was not a legend. He was a living, breathing, very large, and very angry Thunder Warrior, who had spent over a century since the supposed Battle of Mount Ararat, operating under the assumed identity of Babu Dakal, a criminal warlord who ran most of the illegal enterprises in Petitioner's city on Terra, right in the shadow of the Imperial Palace itself. He controlled food, drugs, weapons, and information, the blood and marrow of a city full of people too poor and too desperate to be of interest to the Imperium's official institutions, surviving in the margins of a civilization that had forgotten they existed. Which is, when you think about it, exactly what you do when you've been officially declared dead by the most powerful being in the galaxy, and you'd very much like to keep not being dead. The Thunder Warriors were the Emperor's first attempt at creating transhuman soldiers. First, before the Space Marines, before the Primarchs, before any of the refined genetic science that the Adeptus Astartes represent, there were 20 legions, the Legiones Contagious, of warriors who had been transformed through the early, brutal, imperfect techniques that the Emperor developed in his laboratories beneath the Proto-Imperial Palace. They were extraordinary. By any reasonable standard, they were the most capable soldiers the human species had ever produced. But they were faster and stronger and more durable than almost anything they would ever fight, and they were utterly dedicated to the Emperor's cause. They were also unstable. The genetic work that created them was good, but it was not good enough. The augmentations that made them superhuman also shortened their lifespans in ways that could not be corrected without effectively rebuilding the entire biological architecture from scratch. Yes, they were burning through their physical resources at rates that a normal human simply would not. A Thunder Warrior who survived battle long enough would begin to deteriorate, becoming more aggressive, less controllable, increasingly prone to the kind of berserker frenzy that was useful in combat but catastrophic in peacetime. Some of them knew this. Toward the end of the Unification Wars, and as it became clear that the Great Crusade would require a different kind of soldier, not just effective warriors, but administrators and diplomats and symbols of imperial civilization, some of the Thunder Warriors began to understand that the Emperor had created them to be temporary. That understanding did not go over well. There are accounts, fragmentary, heavily classified, are accessible only through the deepest inquisitorial archives of Thunder Warriors confronting the Emperor directly about their shortened lifespans, of men who had broken nations and shattered armies demanding to know why their creator had built them to burn out. The Emperor did not explain himself to their satisfaction. The explanations he offered, if he offered any, were not adequate to men who had given everything and were beginning to understand that they had been designed as disposable. The official story, the story that appears in every imperial history not locked behind inquisitorial seals, is simple and clean and carries the weight of tragedy that makes for good myth. The remaining Thunder Warriors, the survivors of years of brutal campaign, were all killed at the Battle of Mount Ararat in 669.M30, the final battle of the Unification Wars. They went down fighting, as warriors should. Yet the banner of lightning was raised at the moment of Terra's unification, and the last Thunder Warrior fell, his work done, his story complete. This story is false. The truth, pieced together from the testimony of Aric Taranis himself, corroborated by fragments from multiple other sources, is considerably more troubling. The Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, his most supremely capable individual warriors, were the only soldiers in the Imperial arsenal who could reliably defeat a Thunder Warrior in direct combat. By the end of the Unification Wars, the Custodes had been quietly repositioned around the locations where the remaining Thunder Warriors were concentrated. This was not a coincidence. This was preparation. At the Battle of Mount Ararat, the Thunder Warriors fought. The battle was real, and the victory was real. And an Aric Taranis did raise the banner of lightning at the moment of Terra's unification. All of that happened. But after the battle, when the celebrations began, when the survivors were exhausted and lowered their guards for the first time in years, the Custodes moved. The final culling of the Thunder Warriors was carried out, according to Taranis, by a cadre of several hundred custodians believed to have been led by the legendary Constantin Valdor himself, supported by several thousand prototype warriors from what would become the First Legion of the Astartes. The Thunder Warriors were taken by surprise, outnumbered, and outmaneuvered. Many were killed where they stood. Others fled and were hunted down over the weeks and months that followed. The story of their heroic deaths in battle was constructed afterward, carefully and thoroughly, by people who had very good reasons to ensure that the true nature of their end was never known. Some survived. A small number, Aric Tyrannus among them, along with a handful of others who were quicker or cleverer or simply luckier than their brothers. Tyrannus went to ground in the city beneath the palace, adopted a new name, and waited, and watched, and survived. The Cerberus insurrection, early in the Great Crusade, offers another fragment of evidence. A group of surviving Thunder Warriors calling themselves the Diet Tar, fewer than 100 of them, Sasir, deteriorating rapidly from the genetic flaws the Emperor had built into their design, rose up in open rebellion. The Emperor dispatched the 12th Legion, what would become the World Eaters, to put them down. Even in their deteriorating state, even outnumbered many times over by one of the greatest Space Marine legions in existence, the Thunder Warriors of the Diet Tar killed 4 to 5 times their number in Astartes before they were finally defeated. 4 to 5 times. Each of them, as in the end, taking with them 4 or 5 of the warriors meant to replace them. Think about what that tells you about what they were, and then think about what it tells you about the Emperor that he decided, when the Unification Wars were over and the Great Crusade was beginning, that these extraordinary warriors, his warriors, men who had given everything in his service, needed to be eliminated rather than integrated, not retired, not honored with positions appropriate to their capabilities, not given sanctuary and allowed to live out whatever remained of their shortened lives in some dignity. Eliminated, in secret, with the cover story written before the blood was dry. The Emperor has defenders in this, even among people who know the full story. The argument is practical. The Thunder Warriors were genetically unstable, were already showing signs of violent deterioration, and would have become an increasingly serious problem during the structured, a long-term civilizational project of the Great Crusade. Space Marines are soldiers, but they're also representatives of Imperial civilization. Rampaging, increasingly insane Thunder Warriors would have been a public relations disaster at minimum and an existential threat at maximum. But there is another argument, and it is harder to dismiss. The Emperor built them knowing they were temporary. He designed the instability into them, intentionally or through corner cutting, and he never told them. Yet he used them fully, extracted every measure of value their short and painful lives could provide, and then disposed of them when they were no longer useful. And he told everyone a story about heroic sacrifice, because heroic sacrifice is a narrative that builds loyalty, and the truth about institutional betrayal is a narrative that destroys it. The Inquisition has sealed everything related to the Thunder Warriors at the highest possible classification levels. The Ordo Redactus has systematically destroyed or suppressed every independent account of the final days of the Unification Wars that does not conform to the official story. Space Marines are taught the name Aric Tyrannus as a hero and a symbol, and they are not taught anything about what actually happened to him and his brothers, because if they were, they might start asking uncomfortable questions. Questions like, if the Emperor was willing to do this to the Thunder Warriors, what does he consider us? Part 7. The Webway Project. The Dream That Died. We need to talk about what the Emperor actually wanted. Not the Imperium, not the Great Crusade, not the vast, grinding war machine that conquered 100,000 worlds over the course of 2 centuries. Those were means. They were tools. They were the scaffolding, extraordinarily costly in lives and suffering and lost possibilities, for something else entirely, the real project, the one he called his great work, yet the one that was so important to him that he abandoned the front lines of the Great Crusade at its height, leaving behind the war he had been personally directing for 2 centuries, handing the entire effort over to Horus because he trusted Horus more than anyone else, going home to Terra to pursue it. The one that, when Magnus the Red accidentally destroyed it through an act of psychic desperation, changed the trajectory of the entire human species for the next 10,000 years. The Emperor's plan was to take humanity out of the warp entirely, not just to reduce reliance on it, not just to make warp travel safer, not just to provide an alternative route structure for Imperial shipping. He wanted to sever the connection between humanity and the Imperium so thoroughly and completely that the Chaos Gods would simply no longer have access to the species. He wanted to take humanity, all of it, every scattered world, every desperate colony, and relocate it, metaphysically speaking, into a space where chaos could not follow. The mechanism for this was the webway. The Eldari, the elder race that humanity would eventually know as the Eldar, had built in the deep past of the galaxy an extraordinary infrastructure. The webway was a network of corridors and tunnels running parallel to real space, constructed from materials that were inherently resistant to warp penetration, connected by stable portals to locations across the galaxy. Our travel within the webway was fast, reliable, and utterly invisible to warp entities. You entered at one point and exited at another, having passed through a space that the Chaos Gods simply could not reach. The Eldari had used this network for millennia. When their civilization collapsed, when Slaanesh was born from the accumulated excess of their excess and tore the center out of their empire, most of the webway's maintenance structures collapsed with them. The portals still existed. The corridors still ran. But without the Eldari attending to them, some sections had decayed or been invaded by warp entities that had found cracks in the dimensional barriers. The Emperor wanted to fix that, and then expand it, and then give it to humanity. Not just as a transportation network. That was the short-term goal, the immediately practical benefit. The long-term ambition was something more fundamental. If humanity could travel and communicate through the webway, if every imperial world was connected to every other through corridors that chaos could not penetrate, then humanity no longer needed navigators. It no longer needed astropaths. It no longer needed to expose its psychic individuals to the warp in order to maintain civilization. And if the Emperor's separate ambitions around human psychic evolution came to fruition within the safe shelter of the webway, then the species could mature into whatever it was meant to become without the constant, grinding attrition of chaos corruption. He had found, deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, an ancient artifact from the dark age of technology, a device he called the Golden Throne, that could serve as a stable portal into the webway and, critically, as a psychic amplifier powerful enough to project the Emperor's will through that portal and maintain the shields that protected the webway corridors from warp intrusion. For years before the Horus heresy began, he had been sitting on that throne, pouring his psychic power through it, sheltering a workforce of tens of thousands of Mechanicus adepts and common laborers who were, deep in the tunnels of the webway below Terra, deconstructing an extension of the network, the first steps of what would eventually, if all went well, become a galaxy-spanning alternative to the warp. He kept this secret, almost completely secret. Very few people in the Imperium, even at its highest levels, knew what he was actually doing in the dungeons of the palace. They knew he was there. They knew he was working on something important. They did not know what. Why the secrecy? Several reasons. And they interlock in the way that the Emperor's reasons always do, each one reinforcing the others. The navigators, the psychic mutant families who made their entire living by guiding ships through the warp, would have been violently opposed to a project that made their services obsolete. The Mechanicus had their own complex relationship with the webway and would have required extensive negotiation. The Chaos Gods, whom if they understood what he was doing before he had built enough of the infrastructure to make disruption difficult, would have moved to stop him. And then Magnus the Red destroyed it in a moment. Magnus, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, the most psychically gifted of the Emperor's sons, a being of almost incomprehensible mental power who had spent his entire life trying to use that power for good, trying to understand the universe, and trying to protect his legion and his people from the very real dangers of psychic corruption. Magnus had been forbidden by the Emperor at the Council of Nicaea from using sorcery. He had agreed, reluctantly, Because the Emperor's reasoning, that uncontrolled psychic power was dangerous, was obviously correct, even if the specific prohibition felt unfair. And then, Magnus saw Horus. He used his psychic abilities to peer into the warp, and he saw what was being done on Davin, and saw the corruption of his brother, understood that a great betrayal was being planned that would cost millions of lives and perhaps end the Imperium before it was fully established. He tried to warn the Emperor through proper channels. A warp storm blocked his astropathic messages. He tried other methods. They failed. Finally, in desperation, he used his greatest powers to burst directly through the psychic wards around the Imperial Palace and deliver his warning in person. His projection tore through the webway, ripped the protective barriers that the Emperor had spent years constructing. In an instant, the carefully shielded corridors below the palace were breached, and the things that had been pressing against those barriers from outside flooded in. Thousands of Mechanicus workers died in seconds. The Legio Custodes and the Sisters of Silence fought a desperate rearguard action to prevent the flood from reaching the palace itself. And the Emperor, with no other option available to him, sat down on the golden throne and held the breach shut with pure psychic force. And he has not been able to leave since. Magnus delivered his warning. The Emperor, already trapped, barely listened. He sent the Space Wolves to bring Magnus in chains. Horus intercepted the order and changed it to a command of destruction. And the Horus heresy began. The dream died in that moment. And the Webway Project, the plan that might have saved humanity from 100,000 years of grinding, bloody stagnation, died because Magnus was trying to do the right thing and lacked the patience to find a safer way to do it. Died because the very power he had been told not to use was the only power that could have reached the Emperor in time. Died because the universe is not a place where plans survive contact with the reality of finite beings trying their best and failing. And when the Horus heresy ended, and the Emperor's broken body was placed on the Golden Throne, it was not the triumph of the Webway Project, but its ruins. Not a portal into a safer future, but a permanent seal over a permanent breach. Not a tool for the liberation of humanity, but a prison cell that the Emperor has occupied ever since. 10,000 years on the Golden Throne. 10,000 years of 1,000 psychers sacrificed every day to keep the Astronomicon burning. 10,000 years of the slow, terrible grinding down of the only plan that ever had a real chance of working. The Inquisition knows this. The highest levels know all of it. And they have decided, with the implacable logic that the Emperor himself would probably recognize, that the population of the Imperium, those billions of people who pray to the Emperor every day, who draw strength from the belief that their God intended this, that the throne is a choice rather than a sentence, must never be given this information. Because if you tell people that the thing keeping the Imperium alive is not a god's deliberate sacrifice, but an accident caused by a son who was trying to help, the specific nature of the tragedy changes everything. It is the difference between our God chose suffering for our sake and our God's best laid plan was destroyed by friendly fire. And we've been improvising ever since. Both are true. But the Inquisition has decided you only get to know one of them. Part 8. The Sensei, the Illuminati, and the Hidden Suns. There are people walking the galaxy right now who carry the Emperor's bloodline in their veins. Not the Primarchs, who are gene sons constructed in a laboratory. Not the Space Marines, who are shaped from gene seed that was built on the Primarch's templates. Actual biological descendants. Children of the man who would become the God Emperor, fathered in the long centuries of his hidden life, their lineages spreading and branching across the millennia until his genetic legacy has dispersed through hundreds of generations of entirely ordinary-seeming people. These people are called the Sensei, and the Inquisition hunts them. In the original formulation of this law, drawn from some of the oldest 40k source material, books published in the earliest days of the setting's development, the Sensei are extraordinary individuals. They are immortal, because the Emperor's genetic legacy carries something of the perpetual quality that defines him. They are psychic blanks. their presence in the warp is essentially zero, making them invisible to psychic detection and immune to psychic attack, in stark contrast to most of his acknowledged genetic heirs, who tend towards psychic ability. That they wander the galaxy fighting oppression and chaos in ways that are recognizable as heroic, but that the official institutions of the Imperium tend to classify as banditry and heresy. They do not know what they are. Most of them are entirely unaware of their heritage. They know they don't age. They know they don't register to psychers. They know they don't fit comfortably into ordinary society, and most of them have concluded reasonably enough that whatever they are, it is not something the Imperium would celebrate. So they hide. There is a secret organization that knows about them, seeks them out, and tries to protect them before the Inquisition finds them first. This organization is called the Illuminati, and its membership is even more unusual than the Sensei themselves. To become illuminated requires surviving something that almost nobody survives, actual demonic possession, and then casting the daemon out, from inside, through sheer force of will. The people who manage this feat, and they are extremely rare, because most people who are possessed by a demon simply cease to be themselves in any meaningful sense, emerge from the experience changed. They have touched chaos directly, have been consumed by it, and expelled it, and the result is an immunity that goes beyond ordinary resistance. Demons cannot affect them. Chaos cannot corrupt them. They have, through the most terrible possible method, become inoculated against the thing that destroys most people who encounter it. The Illuminati's goal is, on its surface, benevolent. Find the Sensei, tell them who they are, protect them from the Inquisition, and prepare for a moment that the Illuminati believe is coming. A moment when the Emperor's physical body finally fails. When the Golden Throne, which has been slowly degrading for 10,000 years, can no longer hold the door closed. Or when the body on the seat ceases to function, and the soul that has been powering the Astronomicon is finally free. Their plan, at that moment, is to sacrifice every Sensei they have collected simultaneously. To pour all of those Emperor-blooded, psychic blank, accumulated potential lives into the warp at once. Because they believe, based on their understanding of how the Emperor himself was created, how the shamans sacrificed themselves to birth the new man, that this mass sacrifice would do something similar. That the Emperor's dispersed biological legacy, combined with the remnant of his soul that has been drifting through the warp, could coalesce into something new and something whole. A new Emperor, a star child, the God Emperor reborn, carrying the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of warp existence and the psychic potential of all his descendants, us into a body capable of actual action. It is a beautiful plan. It is also, from almost every verifiable angle, probably doomed to fail, and possibly an elaborate Sinchian trick. This is where you have to be careful in the way you think about this, because the lore around the Sensei and the Illuminati is genuinely contested. Games Workshop has, at various points, written it out of canon entirely, then written fragments of it back in through other stories and references, and then been deliberately ambiguous about its status in more recent publications. The official position seems to be that the cult of the Star Child, when examined by the Inquisition, looks suspiciously like a Tsinchian operation. The god of change and manipulation having constructed an elaborate scheme disguised as a genuine hope, designed to achieve some goal that only becomes clear when it's too late to stop it. But the most recent Horus Heresy material complicates this. The Horus Heresy series, specifically in its final volumes, contains hints and explicit confirmations that something called the Star Child concept is still alive in the setting's mythology. There are references to the Emperor casting off the most human, most compassionate aspects of himself in order to do what was necessary at the end of the heresy, and the possibility that those cast-off aspects became a separate fragment of his soul that has been drifting in the warp ever since, growing, accumulating potential, waiting. The most recent lore around the psychic awakening, the setting-wide upheaval that has been building throughout 8th and 9th edition 40k, contains visions reported across astropathic relay networks. visions of a golden infant, visions of a radiant being rising from a throne made of light, visions that those who receive them interpret as the star child stirring, as the emperor preparing for some new form of existence that transcends the rotting body on the golden throne. Whether those visions are genuine, whether they represent a real development in the emperor's warp presence, or whether they are exactly the kind of beautiful, compelling, hope-inducing fiction that Sench specializes in producing, nobody knows. Not with certainty. But the Inquisition treats them as the latter. The Ordo Malleus has a standing operation, classified at the highest levels, dedicated to finding and eliminating anyone who claims to be a sensei or who spreads information about the Star Child theory. They do this, officially, because the doctrine is heretical and potentially chaos-tainted. And that is true. It might be. The Inquisition might be right, but there is another possibility. The possibility that the Illuminati are right, that the sensei are real, and that what the Inquisition is actually doing, what it has been doing for thousands of years, is eliminating the components of the only plan that has any hope of actually restoring the Emperor to something approaching full function. If that possibility is true, then the Inquisition has been spending 10,000 years destroying the Emperor's only chance of recovery, in his name, using his authority, out of a sincere desire to protect his legacy. The universe is not kind enough to tell us which possibility is correct. Part 9. The Golden Throne. A dying god, growing stronger. The Golden Throne is failing. This is not a secret, exactly. There are enough people within the upper reaches of the Imperium's various institutions who know this, or who have seen the evidence and drawn the obvious conclusion that it could not really be called secret. It is more like a truth that exists in a strange administrative limbo, where everyone who matters knows about it and nobody discusses it openly because the implications are too enormous and too terrible to be processed through normal institutional channels. The device is degrading. 10,000 years of continuous operation, powered by a technology that nobody fully understands anymore. The tech priests who maintain it do so through a combination of genuine technical knowledge, as received tradition, and what amounts to superstition, have taken their toll. Systems that were designed to run indefinitely have developed faults. Components that were supposed to be self-repairing have stopped repairing. The soul furnaces that consume 1,000 psychers every day are becoming less efficient, requiring more lives to produce the same output. Archmagos Belisarius Call, as one of the few people in the Imperium with the technical knowledge to understand even a fraction of what he's looking at, has described the throne's current operational status with the kind of restrained alarm that engineers use when they don't want to start a panic. The Drukhari, the dark cousins of the Aeldari, a species that the Imperium has good reason to hate and fear, were at one point approached, in absolute secrecy, by Imperial agents seeking their assistance in repairing or sustaining the Emperor's biological systems. The Drukhari, who know things about extending the life of a body beyond its natural limits that no human scientist has ever approached, agreed to an exchange that involved their access to souls for their various dark purposes. This negotiation was discovered by the Inquisition. The Inquisition responded with their standard tools. The deal fell through. The throne continued to degrade. And this is the part that genuinely unsettles everyone who has looked at it closely enough. The Emperor himself seems to be getting stronger, not physically. The body on the throne is still the body it has always been, broken, sustained by cybernetics and sacrifice and psychic will, rather than by any ordinary biological function, slowly but inexorably decaying in ways that the life support systems can compensate for but not reverse. The flesh is not recovering. That the flesh is never going to recover. But in the warp, in the immaterium, where psychic entities exist and grow and develop, according to rules that have nothing to do with the physical condition of any associated body, something is happening. The worship of the Emperor, 10,000 years of it, pouring across the galaxy in an unbroken stream of genuine, sincere, passionate belief from billions upon billions of human beings is doing what faith always does in the warp. It is feeding something, but it is creating, in the Imperium, a structure, a presence, an entity that is taking shape from the combined psychic energy of humanity's devotion in the same way that the Chaos Gods took shape from the combined psychic energy of humanity's suffering and desire and despair. The great, terrible, wonderful, horrifying irony is this: the Emperor, who explicitly rejected divinity, who told his sons repeatedly that he was not a god and should not be worshipped, Shao, who built the imperial truth specifically to prevent people from worshipping supernatural entities because worship feeds those entities. The Emperor is being worshipped. He has been worshipped, continuously and passionately, for 10,000 years, by more people than have ever worshipped any other single entity in human history. And it appears to be working. Not in the way that the architects of the imperial creed intended, not in the sense of providing the Emperor with the literal divine power they believe their prayers invoke, but in the much stranger, much more ambiguous sense that the psychic entity forming in the warp from 10,000 years of human faith is becoming something genuinely powerful. Something that is recognizably the Emperor, or at least recognizably constructed from the image of the Emperor that billions of people carry in their minds. Something that has agency, that acts, that reaches into the material universe in the subtle ways that the Chaos Gods do, through the inspired actions of believers, through the inexplicable protection of the faithful, through the phenomenon of imperial saints who return from death in ways that look, by any rational analysis, exactly like the return of a champion of a warp god. As Sister Celestine, the living saint, a woman who dies and comes back repeatedly, carrying power that should not exist in a rational materialist universe. Every honest examination of Sister Celestine's abilities points toward the same conclusion. She is doing exactly what the champions of the Chaos Gods do. She is accessing the power of a warp entity through sincere devotion and channeling it in the material universe. The warp entity she is drawing on is the Emperor. The Emperor who said he was not a god is becoming one. Not because he wants to. Everything in his behavior and stated philosophy suggests he would find this deeply uncomfortable. But because 10,000 years of sincere mass worship has created, in the place where psychic entities live, a structure that is very hard to distinguish from a god. Robert Gilliman knows this. But when he returned from 10,000 years of stasis and walked into the throne room to speak with his father, for the first time since the Horus heresy, what passed between them in that psychic conference left the Primarch shattered. He emerged from that conversation, grey-faced and lost. He said, in subsequent private remarks that were recorded and eventually classified, in that his father was no longer entirely what he once was. He said the conversation was like speaking with something that was simultaneously his father and something that was not his father, something that had been built on top of his father by 10,000 years of human faith, in the way that a coral reef is built on the bones of whatever died to create it. Guilliman, who had spent his entire life before the heresy as a rational materialist, who had believed in the imperial truth more completely than almost any of his brothers, emerged from that room having reconsidered fundamental aspects of his worldview. He did not become a believer in the traditional sense. He still approaches the ecclesiarchy with the wariness of a pragmatist. But he stopped arguing that the Emperor was simply a very powerful human. The evidence in that room had been too direct. And then there is the question of the Talisman of 7 Hammers. Installed by the Primarch Vulcan at the Emperor's direction, this device is a dead man's switch. If the Golden Throne fails completely, if the Emperor's psychic presence in the warp collapses, the talisman will trigger the destruction of the Imperial Palace and all of Terra. The Emperor himself chose to install this. He specifically planned for the scenario where the throne fails and he dies, and his plan for that scenario was to take Terra with him rather than let it fall to chaos. Well, what does that tell you about what he expects the Chaos Gods to do if they ever get access to the throne world? And what does it tell you about the Emperor's own assessment of his chances of surviving without the throne? The Mechanicus talks, in the most hushed and carefully chosen language, about the possibility of a solution. Call has been working on something, with a secrecy that even other Mechanicus figures find unusual. Gilliman has been consulting with Aeldari contacts that the Inquisition has officially been instructed not to look at too directly. There are rumors, always rumors, in the Imperium, where information is both the most dangerous commodity and the most tightly controlled, of project files referring to a revivification protocol that would require components and technologies currently classified at levels above what most High Lords can access. The throne is failing. The Emperor is growing. And somewhere in between those two facts, the fate of the Imperium hangs by threads of ancient machinery and daily sacrifice, counting down toward a moment that everyone in a position to know anything is very quietly trying to prevent. Part 10. What the Inquisition actively buries. The suppression apparatus in practice. Let us talk about the mechanics of the thing. Because it is one matter to understand that the Inquisition suppresses information, that is hardly surprising in a civilization defined by institutional control of knowledge, and quite another to understand how that suppression works in practice. What specific operations have been undertaken in the name of protecting the Imperium from its own history, and what the human cost of that protection has been. The Inquisition is not, in its own conception, but an organization built primarily around hiding things. Its official mandate is the protection of the Imperium and humanity from the three primary threats that its founders identified: the alien, the heretic, and the mutant. The Ordo Xenos handles the alien. The Ordo Hereticus handles the heretic. The Ordo Malleus handles the demonic. These three great divisions represent the public-facing structure of the organization, the parts that the average citizen might have heard of, but the parts that show up in recruitment propaganda and religious instruction as the terrifying but necessary defenders of the faith. But there is a fourth category of inquisitorial activity that does not appear in any public document, that has no officially named ordo, that is funded through budget lines buried so deep in the administratum's labyrinthine accounting that even the High Lords of Terror have trouble tracking exactly how much of the Imperium's treasury flows into it. The suppression of knowledge about the Emperor himself. There is a faction of inquisitors who have made this their life's work, who have dedicated careers spanning centuries to the identification, containment, and elimination of information that contradicts the official narrative of the Imperial Creed. They are sometimes called, by the very small number of people who know they exist, the Ordo Redactus, the Redactors, the Erasers. But none of these names appear in any document that has ever been officially filed with the Inquisition's administrative apparatus, because the Ordo Redactus, if it exists, would be the first to ensure that records of its own existence were handled with the same thoroughness it applies to everything else. What they do is this: they watch. They monitor scholarship, academic institutions, independent historians, mechanicus researchers who might accidentally stumble into forbidden territory while pursuing otherwise legitimate inquiries. They track the movement of ancient texts and artifacts. They maintain relationships with the administratum's archivists on thousands of worlds. Relationships that allow them to flag and intercept documents that contain certain key terms, certain dangerous questions, certain combinations of historical inquiry that suggest someone is getting close to something they shouldn't. When a historian on some middle-tier agri-world begins cross-referencing the dates of the Unification Wars with records of specific genetic experiments and asks questions that start to point toward the Thunder Warriors and what happened to them, the redactors notice. They assess the risk. If the historian is no one important, operating in isolation, and unlikely to share their findings widely, the response might be subtle. Documents disappear from archives. Funding for research is quietly withdrawn. Institutional support evaporates in ways that seem like coincidence. The historian abandons their line of inquiry, frustrated by the sudden unavailability of sources, and moves on to something else. If the historian is someone important, or if they have already shared their findings, the response is more direct. Inquisitorial authority is invoked. Documents are seized. In extreme cases, the Inquisition's definition of extreme being somewhat different from what an ordinary person might expect, the historian themselves is invited to a conversation from which they do not return in any form that carries memory of what they discovered. This sounds monstrous when described plainly. It is meant to. Because it is monstrous, the Inquisition has spent 10,000 years murdering curious people who ask the wrong questions, are burning archives that contained inconvenient truths, destroying artifacts whose very existence called into question aspects of the imperial narrative that the institution has decided must be protected at any cost. The people who do this work tell themselves, and this is important because very few of them are simply sadists who enjoy it, that the alternative is worse. That the stability of the Imperium, which is the thing that keeps humanity alive in a universe full of things that want humanity dead, depends on the faith of billions of people who would lose that faith if they understood what their faith is actually built on. They may be right. The argument is not stupid. A civilization held together by shared belief, forced to choose between the comforting lie and the destabilizing truth, might genuinely make the calculation that the lie is worth the blood it costs. Smart people have made this argument across the full span of human history, and smart people have been wrong about it just as often as they have been right. The First War for Armageddon is perhaps the clearest example of the Inquisition's suppression apparatus in practice, because it is a case where the cover-up was enormous enough that its outlines have become visible despite every effort to conceal them. The war itself was catastrophic, a chaos incursion led by the demon-possessed Primarch Angron, the Lord of the World Eaters, who descended on the hive world of Armageddon with a host of bloodletters and corrupted mortals and nearly tore the planet apart before a combined force of Space Marines and Imperial Guard managed to drive him back into the warp. The Grey Knights were involved, because when a Primarch demon is involved, the Grey Knights are always involved. The victory was real. As Armageddon was saved, Angron was banished. The Imperium was protected from a demonic invasion of terrifying scale. And then the Inquisition, specifically Inquisitor Lord Gazul Vandir, operating under authority granted by the Ordo Malleus, quarantined the entire surviving population of Armageddon. Every soldier who had fought in the war, every civilian who had survived the occupation, every member of the Imperial Guard regiments who had bled and died to push back the demonic tide. Hundreds of thousands of people, possibly millions. They had been exposed to demonic forces. They had witnessed things that the Inquisition classified as too dangerous for ordinary minds to carry. And so every single one of them was either killed outright or subjected to mind-wipe procedures severe enough to destroy the memories of the war entirely. And in many cases, enough of the surrounding memory that the people subjected to them were fundamentally different people afterward. While the Grey Knights, the existence of whom is, technically, one of those classified facts that civilians are not supposed to know, were among the forces deployed during the quarantine. Space Marines who had been sanctified against corruption, whose very presence was supposed to be a guarantee of purity, participated in the mass purging of the people they had just fought beside. When the surviving Space Marine chapters who had fought in the war, the Space Wolves chief among them, led by a Logan Grimnar, who was absolutely furious, learned what was happening, the result was what has been classified in the records that still exist as the Months of Shame. The Space Wolves confronted the Inquisition over the purge. The Inquisition insisted on their authority. The confrontation came close, terrifyingly close, to an open military engagement between two factions of the Imperium's own military. A Space Marine chapter and an Inquisitor Lord, each convinced they were right. Each backed by institutions with the firepower to cause catastrophic damage if they chose to use it. It was eventually resolved through the kind of deeply uncomfortable political compromise that characterizes the Imperium at its most functionally dysfunctional. The people who had not yet been processed were allowed to survive, though under varying levels of monitoring and restriction. The Grey Knights modified their procedures to be less total in their memory erasure. The Space Wolves were compensated with the kind of institutional concessions that powerful organizations offer to other powerful organizations when they have done something embarrassing and want the witness to feel bought off. And the entire event was classified. Not just the specific details of the cover-up, but the war itself. The first war for Armageddon was erased from the official history of Armageddon. The planet's own population is subjected to varying levels of the Inquisition's memory modification, does not know it happened. There is a gap in their history, a gap that is visible to anyone who looks at the dates and asks where the records from that period went. But the records that would fill it are held in vaults, with access restricted to inquisitors, operating under specific authority that very few of them ever receive. The people of Armageddon go about their lives on a world whose history has been edited, and they worship the Emperor in cathedrals built on ground that was once soaked with the blood of their ancestors, ancestors whose sacrifice in his service has been officially classified as never having happened. This is what the Inquisition does, not in the abstract, not as a hypothetical, but as a concrete operational reality that has been applied to populations across the galaxy for as long as the Inquisition has existed. And it suppresses the uncomfortable histories, not because it is evil in some simple pantomime sense, but because it has concluded that the discomfort of those histories, multiplied across a population already living under enormous stress and uncertainty in a genuinely dangerous galaxy, would cost more than the suppression does. The argument is coherent. The argument is also something that the people whose memories were erased, the people whose curiosity was punished with death, the people whose sacrifice was classified into non-existence, were never given any voice in making. There is an entire counter-Inquisition tradition that has grown up, in fragments and whispers, among scholars and archivists who have noticed the gaps in history and begun to ask questions about what fills them. They are called by various names in various places: truth-seekers, revisionists, historiators, in some contexts simply heretics in the administrative sense of people who have departed from the officially sanctioned version of reality. Many of them are found and dealt with by the redactors. Some of them are found and recruited, because the Inquisition, in its deep pragmatism, is not above using curious people who have already found pieces of the truth in service of maintaining the larger structures of concealment. A very few of them, operating in the most careful ways, shall in the most obscure corners of the Imperium, in the archives on worlds too insignificant to attract regular monitoring, have assembled pictures of what lies beneath the official history. They are not complete pictures. They are probably not accurate in every detail, but they are pointed in the right direction. And the Inquisition knows they exist and has decided, in the cold calculus that defines every decision that institution makes, that the cost of eliminating them all is higher than the cost of containing them, for now. Part 11. The Primarchs. As political infrastructure, what they were really built for. There is something about the Primarchs that is almost never discussed in the official literature, or partly because it makes the Emperor look calculating in ways that complicate the narrative of a wise father guiding beloved sons, and partly because understanding it requires accepting a version of the Emperor's personality that is genuinely difficult to sit with. The Primarchs were not created to be generals. They were created to be governors. This is a subtle distinction that carries enormous implications. The Great Crusade required generals, obviously. The reunification of the human species across a galaxy full of alien empires and human civilizations that had evolved in strange directions during the Long Night required military capability on a scale that the ordinary institutions of the Imperium could not provide. The Primarchs were extraordinary military commanders. That part of their design worked essentially as intended, whatever disasters followed. But the Emperor, when he engineered those 20 souls, Ein was thinking farther ahead than the Crusade itself. He was thinking about what came after, about the administration of a reunified human civilization so vast that even the combined logistical might of the administratum could not manage it without the kind of extraordinary individuals who could hold entire sectors together through the force of their personal authority their military record, their capacity to inspire loyalty that ordinary administrators could not command. Yet each Primarch was designed with a specific emotional range, a specific approach to problems, a specific kind of loyalty structure that the Emperor had calculated would be useful in the particular corner of the galaxy he intended to place them. Robute Guilliman, whose obsessive devotion to law and procedure makes him the ideal governor of a stable, complex, administrative state. Rogel Dawn, whose absolute reliability under siege conditions makes him ideal for the defense of territories that cannot be allowed to fall. The Khan, whose fluid, fast-moving philosophy makes him ideal for territories too vast to administer through static defense alone. The Chaos Gods understood this before the Emperor's own sons did, when they began to corrupt the Primarchs, or rather, when the conditions of their scattering gave the Chaos Gods the opportunity to shape the Primarchs during their formative years. They targeted specifically the features that made each one valuable as a post-Crusade administrator. Lorgar's capacity for inspiring mass devotion turned from the Emperor toward the Chaos Gods. Magnus's intellectual hunger turned toward knowledge sources that the Emperor had explicitly warned him away from. Perturabo's administrative precision and engineering genius turned towards siege warfare against the Emperor's own infrastructure. The corruption of the Primarchs was not random. It was surgical. It targeted the things that made them most dangerous as potential long-term architects of stable human civilization. Because stable human civilization is, from the Chaos Gods' perspective, a catastrophic threat to their existence. Stable, functional, prosperous human societies produce less of the raw emotional suffering and disorder that feeds the warp entities. The Chaos Gods have a direct material interest in preventing the Emperor's post-Crusade plan from succeeding. They succeeded in breaking enough of the Primarchs that the plan became impossible to implement. Even the Primarchs who remained loyal found their relationships with each other and with their father fractured to the point where the cooperative post-Crusade governance structure that the Emperor had in mind could not function as designed. Guilliman, sitting in the ruins of the Imperium Secundus he had built during the heresy, writing the Codex Astartes, was building something different from what his father had designed him for, not better or worse, necessarily. The Codex has kept the Adeptus Astartes functional for 10,000 years, but different. A defensive, conservative document written by a man trying to ensure that what remained could survive, rather than the expansive, administrative framework that the full set of Primarchs might have built together if the heresy had not happened. The Imperium of the 41st Millennium is, in this reading, an emergency measure, a stopgap. Well, the thing you build when the real plan has been destroyed, and you need something that will hold until the real plan can be attempted again. Guilliman, returning from 10,000 years of stasis, has said as much in documents that remain classified. He does not believe the current Imperium represents anything like what his father intended to build. He believes it represents what was left after the heresy, as patched and shored up by generations of administrators who understood the letter of the systems they had inherited, but not the spirit that animated them. And he is rebuilding, slowly, carefully, with the Primaris Marines and the Indomitus Crusade and the political reforms that the High Lords have been loudly and pointlessly protesting since his return. He is not rebuilding the Crusade-era Imperium. That window closed when the Primarchs fell, when the Webway project was destroyed, when the Emperor was entombed. He is building something that can function without the full set of tools his father designed. Something that can hold against the darkness, not through the perfection of its design, but through the stubbornness of its survival instinct. Whether it is enough is the question that the 41st Millennium asks every day, on every battlefield, in every cathedral and archive and interrogation room across the galaxy. Part 12. Who actually runs the Imperium? The High Lords of Terror are, in the official structure of the Imperium, the governing council that manages the day-to-day administration of a civilization spanning 1,000,000 worlds. They are the representatives of the Imperium's most powerful institutions, the Administratum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the Officio Assassinorum, the Adeptus Astartes, the Astra Militarum, and several others whose specific membership in the council shifts depending on the political fortunes of the moment. In theory, they govern in the emperor's name, implementing his will as expressed in the legal and administrative tradition he established during the Great Crusade. In practice, they are a council of institutional representatives whose primary interest is the continuation and expansion of their own institution's power, and who use the emperor's authority, which none of them have any meaningful access to, given that he has been unable to communicate for 10,000 years, to justify whatever decisions best serve their institutional interests. The administratum wants to expand its control over the flow of information and resources across the Imperium. The ecclesiarchy wants to deepen its grip on the spiritual and cultural life of the population. The Inquisition wants the autonomy to pursue its mandate without oversight from anyone. The Mechanicus wants access to ancient technology and the authority to restrict other institutions from developing competing capabilities. The Officio Assassinorum wants to remain the only option for targeted elimination of threats to imperial stability. These interests do not always align. In fact, they rarely align. The history of the High Lords of Terror is largely a history of internal conflict, our political maneuvering, temporary alliances, and mutual betrayal among institutions that are theoretically working toward the same goal and in practice constantly undermining each other in pursuit of institutional advantage. Guilliman, returning to Terra, found this situation deeply familiar and deeply depressing. He had seen similar dynamics in the councils of his own Ultramarines Legion during the Crusade. It had dealt with the political friction of powerful individuals whose institutional identities sometimes overrode their personal commitment to the shared mission. But the version he found on Terra was orders of magnitude worse. 10,000 years of accumulated institutional calcification, of traditions that had hardened from pragmatic procedures into sacred dogma, us of people who had been promoted through hierarchies that rewarded the protection of institutional prerogatives over the advancement of actual human welfare. He cleaned house, brutally by his standards, which means politically rather than militarily, though the distinction between those two things in the Imperium is always somewhat theoretical. He removed high lords who resisted his reforms. He restructured the council to give himself effective veto power over its major decisions. And he rewrote administrative procedures that had been calcifying for millennia in ways that were actively harmful to the Imperium's function. And the institutions pushed back. They always push back. The High Lords of Terror do not survive 10,000 years by being amenable to reform. What Guilliman did was possible only because he is a primarch, because the institutional reverence for the Emperor and his sons was powerful enough to override the normal resistance of entrenched bureaucracy. It's because the primarch's authority is the one kind of authority that the Imperium's institutional structures are not equipped to resist. But Guilliman is one person, one extraordinary person, but one. He cannot be everywhere. He cannot oversee every decision made by every institution across a million worlds. The reforms he has implemented on Terra will propagate outward at the speed of communication in an empire that uses the warp for most of its long-distance messaging, which is to say, slowly, unevenly, with gaps and distortions, and local interpretations that will gradually drift from whatever he intended. The question of who actually runs the Imperium is, in the 41st millennium, genuinely difficult to answer. Not because there is no one in charge, but because the things that are in charge, the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of institutional tradition, the inertia of procedures that have been followed so long that no one remembers why they were established, the self-perpetuating logic of hierarchies that exist primarily to maintain their own existence, are not persons. They are systems. And reforming systems is always harder than removing persons, because systems do not die when you kill their current occupants. They simply install new ones who have been trained by the system to perpetuate the system. The Emperor understood this. He built institutions that were designed to resist this kind of calcification, that had internal mechanisms to prevent the drift from purpose to self-preservation that inevitably afflicts human organizations given enough time. Those mechanisms did not survive the heresy intact. 10,000 years of operating without the emperor's active guidance, without the living memory of what the institutions were supposed to be for, without the corrective pressure of a unified leadership that could override institutional selfishness when necessary, and had allowed the drift to proceed exactly as the emperor's safeguards were designed to prevent. And so the Imperium grinds on, vast and ancient and increasingly unlike itself, held together by the faith of billions and the sacrifice of countless, governed by institutions that use the emperor's name to justify their power, while understanding the emperor's actual vision less with every passing generation. The Inquisition suppresses this analysis. Not because it is wrong, the smarter inquisitors know it is right, but because a population that understood it clearly might draw conclusions about the legitimacy of the institutions claiming authority in the emperor's name that would be deeply destabilizing. Better, the Inquisition has decided, for people to believe the institutions are what they claim to be. Better for the machinery to run, even if it is running wrong, than for the machinery to stop. Whether that calculation is correct is the question that the 42nd Millennium will eventually have to answer. Interlude, a note on sources and the reliability of everything. Before we get to the final piece, I want to pause for a moment on something that I think is genuinely important when you're exploring this kind of deep lore, and something that actually applies far beyond Warhammer 40k. Everything we've discussed today exists, within the fiction, in a state of epistemic uncertainty. At the 40,000 setting is one where the primary sources of information are institutions with strong interests in shaping what you believe. The Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, the Administratum, and the alternative sources are documents that those same institutions have tried to destroy, which means the ones that survived either survived because no one noticed them or because someone kept them hidden, which means they have their own potential biases and agendas built in. The Horus Heresy novels, which are the closest thing the setting has to a detailed accounting of the period we've been discussing, are themselves explicitly presented as reconstructed histories, documents assembled by inquisitors from fragmentary sources, many of which contradict each other, all of which have to be read with an awareness of who wrote them and why. The account of the Thunder Warrior's fate that comes from an Astartes historian is going to look different from an account recovered from a Thunder Warrior's personal record. The account of the Emperor's behavior at Molech, written by an Imperial military officer, is going to look different from an account written by someone who was trying to make sense of it 1,000 years later. This is actually one of the things that makes 40k lore genuinely interesting to dig into. But the setting is not presenting itself as authoritative. It is presenting itself as a stack of competing narratives, all of which contain partial truths, none of which can be fully trusted. And the reader's job is to read them as they would read history in the real world, with an awareness that every source has a perspective, that the most convenient explanation is usually worth questioning, and that the most important questions are often the ones that the most powerful actors in a given situation have the strongest interest in making sure you never ask. The Inquisition, in the 40k universe, is doing exactly what powerful institutions do in the real world. It is managing information in service of institutional stability. The Emperor himself, throughout his history, did exactly what powerful individuals do in the real world. He made decisions without full consultation, but justified them by the outcomes he was trying to achieve, and left the people around him to deal with the consequences of information they were never given. This does not make him a villain. It makes him a person in an impossible situation, making impossible decisions with incomplete information and limited time. Which is, if you think about it, it's exactly the story the shamans were telling when they gathered together 10,000 years ago and decided to build something that could handle what none of them could handle alone. The tragedy is that the thing they built is still trying to do that job, still holding the door closed, still working through the pain of what it costs, and the institution built to serve it has calcified around it in ways that make it harder to do what it was made to do. And the people who know this, the Gillimans and the Calls and the small number of inquisitors who have allowed themselves to understand what they serve, are trying to fix it without breaking the faith of the people who need the faith to survive. It is a very human story. In a universe of gods and demons and galaxy-spanning wars, it is the most human story being told. Part 13. The specific things the Inquisition actively buries. We have talked about individual secrets, individual events and decisions that the Inquisition suppresses or distorts. But it is worth pausing to examine the institution itself, to look at the mechanism of suppression, rather than just the things being suppressed. Because the Inquisition is not simply an organization that keeps secrets. It is an organization that has, over 10,000 years, developed an extraordinarily sophisticated philosophy of information control that is worth understanding in its own right. There are within the Inquisition two specific sub-organizations that exist in open and perpetual conflict with each other. They are the Ordo Redactus and the Ordo Originatus. The Ordo Originatus is dedicated to finding out what actually happened. Their purpose is the recovery of genuine historical truth, the digging through buried archives, the comparison of contradictory sources, the application of careful scholarship to the question of what the Imperium's founding actually looked like versus what the official record claims. They are, in their way, historians of extraordinary rigor operating in the most hostile possible environment for honest scholarship. The Ordo Redactus exists specifically to undo their work. Their mandate is explicit: identify records and information that, if widely known, would undermine public faith in the Imperium, its institutions, or the Emperor himself, and ensure that those records are not widely known. They burn documents. They reassign scholars whose research has led them to dangerous conclusions. They rewrite the official histories of events that were witnessed by too many people to simply deny, weaving new interpretations around inconvenient facts until the facts themselves are buried under layers of sanctioned narrative. These two organizations have been in active opposition for most of the Imperium's history, and the Ordo Redactus wins the majority of their confrontations simply by virtue of having the institutional authority to make things disappear, while the Ordo Originatus can only produce records that it then has to hope someone important will read and act on before the Redactus notices they exist. It is worth noting that Rabut Guilliman, upon his return from stasis, established the Logos Historica Verita, a new organization of scholars he personally trained in the methods he had developed during the Great Crusade, explicitly chartered to recover the true history of the Imperium. He established it, in part, precisely because he recognized that the Ordo Redactus had been systematically destroying exactly the historical knowledge that humanity needed in order to make intelligent decisions about its own future. Yet the Inquisition's response to the Logos Historica Verita has been, to put it diplomatically, complicated. Beyond the abstract institutional conflict, there are specific categories of information that the Inquisition systematically suppresses. The truth about chaos is the most fundamental. The fact that the chaos gods are real, that they are accessible, and that they actively seek to corrupt humanity is known only to those imperial citizens who have direct operational contact with heretics and chaos-tainted forces. For the general population, the existence of chaos as a real metaphysical phenomenon, rather than simply a synonym for political chaos and social disorder, is classified. Knowing too much about chaos, if you are an ordinary citizen, is grounds for execution. And the events of the First War for Armageddon are suppressed so completely that even the inhabitants of Armageddon itself believe they have been through only 2 major wars, not 3. The Inquisition, after the war ended, rounded up the survivors, the soldiers who had fought and the civilians who had witnessed what was fought against, and processed them, sterilized them, placed them in labor camps from which they did not return, then recolonized the planet with people who knew nothing. The Space Wolves refused to allow this to happen cleanly. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf, spent months in open defiance of the Inquisition's Armageddon Containment Task Force, a period the Grey Knights themselves called the Months of Shame, because the entire affair required them to pursue Space Wolves and attack Imperial Guard transports, rather than the enemies they existed to fight. The Inquisition attempted to planetary destroy 3 nearby worlds that had received refugees, and nearly attacked the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris with a full battle fleet before the situation was grudgingly de-escalated. The survivors were scattered, some escaped, many did not. And the official record of Armageddon contains no reference to the First War, because information about what was fought, about Angron, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, walking the surface of an imperial world at the head of a chaos army, is classified beyond the reach of any civilian institution. The Grey Knights themselves are classified. The existence of a Space Marine chapter, specifically recruited, trained, and deployed to fight demons, is something that the Inquisition has worked very hard to keep from the general imperial population, because knowing that such a force exists confirms, by implication, that demons also exist and are considered a significant enough threat to require a dedicated military response. The Horus heresy is not suppressed in the same way. 10,000 years of myth-making have turned it into something that everyone knows the shape of, in the same way that everyone knows the shape of a religious story. But the specific mechanics of what happened, the specific decisions made by specific people, the reasons why those decisions made sense within the information environment of the time, those are heavily managed. The Primarchs are heroes or villains. The traitors are evil and the loyalists are pure, and the Emperor sacrificed himself for humanity's sake. This is the story. It is not the story that actually happened, as we have seen, but it is the story that the Inquisition needs people to believe, because it is a story about simple moral clarity in a universe that offers very little. The Emperor knew about the Chaos Gods. He made deals with things he should not have dealt with. He built civilizations on deliberate deceptions, but he eliminated the people who served him when their service was complete. He pursued a plan that was disrupted by his own son's loyalty, and the disruption left him trapped forever on a machine built for a purpose he will never accomplish. And now he is becoming the very thing he spent 10,000 years trying to prevent humanity from creating. All of this is true. All of this is suppressed. And all of it, if you sit with it long enough, makes a terrible and coherent kind of sense. Our Part 14, the greatest secret of all. We have opened many doors today. Some of them contain things that were ugly, and some of them contain things that were complicated, and some of them contained things that felt, when you looked at them clearly, like tragedy. The tragedy of the best laid plans. The tragedy of people who were trying very hard and failing in ways they could not have predicted. But there is one more door, the last one. And the one that the Inquisition guards not with armies or redacted records, but with something more fundamental than either of those things. They guard it with the knowledge that, if you understand it, really understand it, it breaks something, not your faith, necessarily. Maybe not even your loyalty, but something. Here it is. The Emperor was right about almost everything. He was right that the Chaos Gods were the defining existential threat to humanity. He was right that widespread religious worship of those entities, even when the worship was directed at him rather than at them, would strengthen them at humanity's expense. He was right that humanity needed to evolve, needed to pass through a period of extraordinary difficulty and transformation before it could reach whatever it was capable of becoming. And he was right that the gap between what humanity needed to survive and what humanity was actually capable of producing without guidance was so enormous that someone extraordinary had to fill it. And he was right, in the most painful and difficult possible way, that the cost of doing these things was going to be terrible, that people were going to die, that people were going to be deceived, that the path from primitive, a fractured old earth to whatever humanity could eventually become would be littered with exactly the kind of atrocity that makes ordinary human beings, when they read the history, want to place the blame somewhere. He accepted that cost, not cheerfully. There is no evidence that he enjoyed any of this, but he accepted it, what with the exhausted clarity of someone who has spent 10,000 years understanding exactly how difficult the problem is, and has found no solution that does not involve significant suffering. The question that the Inquisition does not want you to ask is not really about the emperor at all. It is about the Imperium that exists in his name, whether the institutions that were built to serve his vision, institutions that have spent 10,000 years hardening into exactly the kind of rigid, mass dogmatic, suppressive hierarchy that he specifically tried not to build, are still serving any version of what he intended. Guilliman has asked this question, openly, in documents that are classified but that exist and that the right people have read. He has described the Imperium of the 41st Millennium as a corrupted shadow of what his father built. He has described the High Lords of Terror as men and women who use the Emperor's name and the Emperor's authority to pursue their own institutional interests. He has described the ecclesiarchy as an organization that has taken the Emperor's deliberate rejection of divinity and turned it into the cornerstone of a state religion that would horrify him if he were conscious enough to understand what he had become. And then Guilliman does what the Emperor did. He makes calculations, that he decides what the situation requires. He lies to people because the truth is too complicated for the moment. He protects information because its release would cause harm that outweighs the benefit of transparency. He has rebuilt the Inquisition, is working within it, is using its tools and its authority and its willingness to do things that nicer people would not do, because he has concluded, as his father concluded, 10,000 years before him, that the situation demands it. The apple, and as they say, does not fall far from the tree, and perhaps that is the real secret. Not any of the specific things the Emperor did or believed or planned or sacrificed, but the fact that the response to knowing all of it, the response that every person who has ever understood it fully seems to arrive at, whether they are a nameless inquisitor burning records in an archive on a world no one remembers, or a resurrected primarch trying to hold a collapsing civilization together with political philosophy and military genius, is the same. You do what the situation requires. You protect what can be protected. You sacrifice what has to be sacrificed. And you tell people the version of the story that keeps them moving forward, because the full story is too big and too dark and too complicated for anyone to process and still function. The Emperor built the Inquisition. He built it into the structure of civilization before the walls went up. And perhaps he did it knowing, with the terrible, patient foresight of someone who has watched human beings for 10,000 years, that eventually someone was going to need to sit in a room that does not officially exist and decide what the rest of humanity gets to know. He did not build the Inquisition to protect humanity from the truth. Well, he built it because he understood something that takes most people an entire lifetime to learn, and that he had learned watching civilizations rise and fall across the span of recorded history. Truth, by itself, does not save people. Knowing the truth and being given the tools, the time, and the safety to use that knowledge, that saves people. Truth dropped into a population that has no context for it, no framework to understand it, no protection from what it implies, does not enlighten. Yes, it panics, it divides, it feeds in the warp, the entities that feed on fear and chaos, and the collapse of social structures. The Emperor knew the chaos gods were real. He suppressed that knowledge. He was wrong to do so in the specific way he chose, and the consequences of that wrongness were catastrophic. But the underlying instinct, that information is a tool, and tools require the right conditions to function properly, is not obviously or entirely wrong. Or what would have happened if the Great Crusade had been conducted in full transparency? If the Emperor had stood before his primarchs and said, "Here is everything, the shamans who made me, the Satan I imprisoned under Mars, the bargain at Molech, the thunder warriors I had killed, the webway I am trying to build, the chaos gods I know are real, and am trying to starve by eliminating religion, including any religion devoted to me." If he had said all of it to everyone in full, maybe it would have helped. Maybe that transparency would have given his sons the context they needed to make better decisions. Maybe Magnus would have understood why the Webway project was so critical and chosen a safer way to deliver his warning. Maybe Lorgar would have understood why the Emperor could not allow him to spread worship, even sincere and beautiful worship, and found another outlet for his extraordinary capacity for devotion. or maybe the knowledge would have been too much. Maybe knowing the full scope of the problem would have broken something in people who needed to believe that the universe was navigable, that the future was possible, that the effort was worth making. Maybe the Emperor, who had watched 10,000 years of human history, knew something about the relationship between information and hope that the rest of us are still figuring out. The tragedy of the Emperor is not that he failed. The tragedy is that he succeeded at almost everything, at creating the infrastructure, the soldiers, the tools, the vision, and was then betrayed in the most heartbreaking way possible by the very qualities that made the people around him worth saving. Magnus's love and desperation, Lorgar's sincere need for meaning, the Thunder Warrior's reasonable anger at being used and discarded, Horus's genuine devotion turned to poison. He built an Imperium to save humanity from chaos. He built it so well that chaos turned the Imperium's own best qualities against it. That is the secret the Inquisition guards, not the specific facts of the dragon beneath Mars, or the bargain at Molech, or the hidden sensei wandering the galaxy. Those are almost easier to handle than this. The deepest secret, the one that would shake the Imperium at its foundations, is this. The Emperor was a man, an extraordinary man, built from the sacrifice of thousands of others, while carrying the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years, wielding power that no mortal has matched before or since. But a man, limited, fallible, capable of tremendous love and tremendous ruthlessness in pursuit of the same goal, capable of seeing farther than anyone around him and still missing things that turned out to matter. And the Imperium that exists in his name, the vast, terrible, yet grinding machine of faith and violence and institutional suppression, is the legacy of a man trying to do something impossible with the resources available to him, which means it could be different, which means the decisions being made in his name every day by institutions that use his authority to justify what they do are not inevitable. They are choices. Choices made by people who have decided that this particular version of what he built is worth protecting. The Emperor, or from his seat on the failing throne, is becoming something new. Whatever he is becoming, it will have been built from the prayers and fears and love of everyone who ever looked up at the stars and hoped that something was watching over them. Maybe what he is becoming will be better than what he was. Maybe it will be exactly what humanity needs. Maybe the 10,000 years of suffering were the price of something extraordinary that is only now beginning. Or maybe it will be another Citan, and another entity of immense power shaped by human need rather than human wisdom, feeding on what feeds it, becoming what it has to be rather than what anyone intended. The Inquisition would prefer you not sit with that question. But here you are, sitting with it anyway. That is perhaps the most human thing about the whole situation. The Emperor spent 10,000 years trying to control the story, and the story keeps finding ways to be told. Closing. What we do with this. The galaxy keeps turning. The golden throne keeps fading. The 1,000 psychers keep dying. The prayers keep rising. Somewhere beneath the surface of Mars, something dreams. Its dreams have shaped an entire religion, and through that religion, an entire civilization. It sleeps in a Necron tomb, placed there by a man who has been sitting motionless on a chair for 10,000 years. It is the machine god of billions of believers who have never heard its name. Somewhere in the corridors of the webway, there are the ruins of the Emperor's greatest work, the half-built extension into a dimension that would have freed humanity from its most dangerous dependency. Broken now, demon-haunted, a monument to what might have been if one loyal son had chosen a different way to save his father. Somewhere on Terra, in the locked vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, there are documents that would change everything, and not because they reveal a villain, but because they reveal something harder to process. A person. Someone who wanted to do right and sometimes did not, who understood the universe more clearly than anyone else and still could not see everything that mattered, who made the best plans available to him and watched them break, and who has been sitting in the wreckage of those plans for 10,000 years, still working, still holding. The Inquisition guards these truths because they have concluded that knowing them is more dangerous than not knowing them. They may be right, they may be wrong. The jury of history is still out on that one, and will be for a very long time. But the truths exist. They are real. And they are, in their strange, dark, complicated way, more magnificent and more tragic than the simple story of the God Emperor and his eternal war against the darkness. And because a God who was always divine and always right and always pure is a comfort. But a man who looked at an impossible situation and decided to try anyway, who gave up everything and was betrayed and trapped and broken, and is still, 10,000 years later, still there, still holding the door closed, still sending light through the Astronomicon, still maintaining the one absolute that has never changed in all the millennia of his existence. There, that humanity will survive. That is something different. That is something that, if you understand what it cost, is almost harder to look at than any of the secrets we've discussed today. Because it is not the story of a god. It is the story of a person who refused to stop. Whatever you think of the Emperor's methods, and there is plenty to think, whatever doubts you carry about the Imperium he built, and the institutions that have run in his name, and there are many legitimate doubts to carry, the basic fact of him endures. The light in the warp, the wall between humanity and everything that would consume it, the voice, they say, still whispering in the dreams of psychers who are sensitive enough to hear, still here, still holding, in a universe this dark. Well, that might be enough.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.